what's up guys, my name is Josh and these are the Sony MDR Z7M2s. Now what the Z7 line is basically Sony's second to top of the line headphone. Now this is slightly more expensive than the standard Z7, slightly different build. They've gone with a more consistent black and now takes their place as their second highest tier headphone. Their first highest tier headphone is this, which is the Sony Z1R. Now, if you're coming from other Sony products, this has a little bit different of a design philosophy than most of their other products. This is not really a consumer grade headphone. This is more of an audiophile grade headphone, a hi-fi grade headphone, and that's reflected in the build, the price, and kind of the sound. Now, price point for this headphone is about $600. The original version is a little bit more expensive on Amazon right now. It's about $650, but it seems to kind of fluctuate up and down a little bit more often than this does. Although I have seen this all the way down to $500. So definitely check the link below to see the current pricing, and it may be lower, so you may be getting a good deal depending on when you get it. So before we talk about the incredible build on this headphone, I do want to talk about the previous version, the standard Z7. Depending on where you're getting your information, I see drastically different things about this compared to the standard M, the Mark 1. Some people say that this is a drastic improvement, others say they completely butchered it. Unfortunately, I don't have a standard Z7 to compare against, so I'm going to be comparing a little bit against the Z1R. And the only reason why I'm doing that is because in some ways, this is almost a budget Z1R. The build philosophy is very close to the same. The driver is very, very close to the same. We'll talk more about that in a second. It's kind of supposed to be Sony's kind of budget Z1R. And today I want to kind of answer that. You know, it's a $600 headphone versus an $1,800 headphone. So I don't exactly expect it to compete, but I do kind of want to answer the question of, is it a budget Z1R? This might just be the best built closed headphone I think I've tried. In terms of the whole design philosophy, it's completely on point. It is great. So what makes this so great is the multiple great design choices that they made. It's not just about the build materials. It's about the shape of the ear pads. It's about the comfort of the actual device. It's about the weight. And all of these choices come in to make a very, very good package. So when you pick this up, it feels super solid in your hands. All the connections, all the tolerances for everything are like perfect. And they don't seem like there's nothing on this that doesn't seem like it would have came like this from day one. And this is a used headphone, and I borrowed this from a friend of mine. So thank you very much. Now the pads here I want to focus on for just a second because they're circular on the outside and ear shaped on the inside, and ear shaped for, you know, left side for left side, right side for right side, of course. And I don't think it's real leather, but it feels great and it's super plush. They're pretty premium pads. The one downside though is that they're not removable. And then let's talk about the thing that you can't miss in there, that gigantic driver that is covered up by kind of the same Fibonacci spiral that's on the Z1R. So you can see some of those design philosophies leak, like the arm brackets, the headband's very, very similar. There's a few bits here and there that are very, very close, including the driver. The Z1R uses a magnesium dome with an aluminum coated outer ring, and you can see that here. And then the Z7's entire driver is aluminum coated, and they're missing that magnesium dome. So further than that, I'm sure there's some changes behind the scenes, probably some, you know, slightly stronger magnets. I know the impedance and sound pressure level is slightly different on the Z1R, so it's clearly not precisely the same driver, but the influence is still there. Now a little bit more information on how big this driver is. HD800s have a 56mm driver. It's known for being a very big driver, and this is 70mm. Now the cable inputs on the back are one of the only problems that I actually have with the build. One, they're twisted, which, you know, love it or hate it. I actually don't mind it because with these particular ones, you don't have to twist the locking mechanism if you don't want to. Or I have this balanced cable from Periapp, by the way, link in the description, that don't have a twist at all and they work just fine. But you do have the option to twist if you want it. What I don't like about it though is that the cables actually interfere with one another, even with Sony's stock cable for this. When you're just putting this down, they kind of bump into each other and you kind of have to lay one on top of the other. And this seems like kind of a silly design oversight, and kind of makes me question why they had to make this angle exactly this steep and why they couldn't slightly adjust this to compensate for that, so you're not putting too much pressure on the cables. It's a small gripe, but it's the only real problem I can find with this build. The rest of the build is super solid. It's great. Now, as an overall picture for the design, like I said before, I love this. It blocks out a reasonable amount. I'll try and duplicate this in the editing software, but I actually like the fit of this better than the Z1R. It's a little bit more comfortable. It's a little bit tighter of a hug and doesn't feel quite as heavy as the Z1R. And that's because the Z7 is actually super light. It's coming in at 340 grams, which, just for reference, a 4XX and the DT1990 Pros are 370 grams, 40 grams heavier than this. And this is built not quite as tough as the 1990. Like the 1990, if it's a studio headphone, you can drop it. You can probably throw it off a building, it'll probably be fine. But this has more of a premium quality feel to the build while still maintaining its lightweight nature. It's kind of like a steel tube versus a carbon fiber tube. They're both very strong, but one's significantly lighter. That's kind of what this feels like. So being a closed back headphone, efficiency is obviously important. This is a 56 ohm headphone and has a sound pressure level of about 98 dB per milliwatt. So what that is supposed to translate to is basically you can run this off of most modern phones that have a decent enough equipment on board with them, and it's probably going to sound okay. In my testing, it sounds obviously better on amplifiers, but the phone sounded pretty good toward, pretty true to what this is supposed to sound like, I would imagine. You can take this mobile, but I do think you're going to benefit from bringing along, maybe a small mobile amplifier, especially if you're already committed to spending this much on a mobile headphone. But where I really see the use case for something like this is kind of like an office, where you're not traveling around a whole lot. Maybe you just leave it at your office and it's there when you need it. Now you might notice around the circumference of the outside of the cup here, there's all these grills. They're on the bottom, they're on the top. And I thought originally when I was just looking at the pictures for this, when I knew it was coming in, I thought that it was going to leak sound a lot more than it does. It's not really like a heavily isolated closed back, but for comparison, this headphone is supposed to be closed back, but it's really kind of not. Like you can hear a lot of what's going on. It does an impressive job of not throwing your music outside of the headphone, not nearly as well as the Z7 does, but the Z7 definitely blocks out a lot more. And I think on that note of the differences between those two, I think that will lead me into the sound department. For better or worse, I think what the Z7 sounds like is if you took this ZR1 or the Z1R and just closed it, like completely closed it off. And it kind of boosts certain frequencies and reduces others, and you end up with kind of a typical V-shaped headphone. And that is a bit disappointing because I'm coming from the Z1R. And the Z1R is very impressive because on paper, it's a V-shaped headphone, but in practice, it really sounds very complete. Every region of this headphone has its own characteristics, and I think it sounds very nice. And then this falls a little bit more subject to that the V-shaped sound signature. And so you get a very boosted treble and a very boosted bass response. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I do think that you can get that sound signature off of much cheaper headphones. And that's one of my only real complaints about this headphone is that it's V-shaped, but not V-shaped in a way that is different from a lot of other things on the market, including some other Sony headphones. Although of those Sonys that I've tried that are not the Z1R and are, below the, this price range or below, this is the best of the Sonys that I personally tried. But I don't know where I would place it in the market. It's kind of odd for me. So I guess we'll start with talking about the treble response. And the treble response is fairly good, but it does have a kind of a timbre blend where, different, let's say metallic instruments, for example, they don't sound distinctly different from one another. Two different types of chimes and a triangle, and you throw all that in there and you can pick them apart, but it's not super obvious. It's not like listening to, the premium $600 open back headphones like a Focal Elex, for example. It doesn't really have quite that level of timbre specificity in the top end. Now the highs here, especially on electronic music, can be a little bit too much. I felt it was quite enjoyable for, actually this whole headphone's really, really great for acoustic recordings or orchestral things. But when you kind of get into that electronic range, it's a little harsh for my ear, although I have a buddy who absolutely loves this headphone. And it's not unenjoyable. It's just, you know, you kind of have to compensate a little bit with volume, and I can't quite get the mid-range to feel as filled out in that electronic music without getting overly sharp highs, at least towards my preference. Now, treble response, while it has its issues, it does have some very good qualities. This is a very detailed headphone, as you would expect for the price. Even though it's a little bit V-shaped, that's just kind of the delivery method of it. But the actual quality of the sound for most areas is okay. It's not through and through super high quality like the Z1R is, but again, very big price difference. Although the top end to me does not feel particularly speedy, but still fairly detailed. I consider it like an 8 out of 10 for detail retrieval for the closed-back headphones that I've tried for the top end. Now, mid-range, it comes with the territory of being a V-shaped headphone. It's a bit disappointing, and the mid-range here is a little bit too low, in my opinion. And I actually want to take a look at the build differences between the Z1R here, because I think this might be part of the issue. So I'm not sure how much I'll be able to capture on video here, so you have to just kind of take my word for it. But the driver in the Z7 is slightly angled. It's not a very steep angle, it's just slightly angled. And then you have these slightly angled pads to compensate. Now the Z1R, on the other hand, has slightly angled pads, of course, but when you actually look at the driver, it is a very, very steep forward angle. So it's kind of shooting, instead of the driver being like this, it's kind of shooting at your ear like this. Now, what that helps with on the Z1R, I suspect, especially hearing a similar driver have two very different deliveries, especially for the vocal performance, is the vocalist on the Z7 sounds kind of just lower volume. It just sounds kind of less, and it's still mostly in your head. The Z1R has great forward presentation, so that vocalist, instead of being lower, it kind of just seems like they're stepped a little bit ahead of you, a little bit more in front of you. So the lower volume seems a little bit more natural towards the shape of the sound, the delivery of the sound. Now, this is a bit, again, of an unfair comparison, just because the significant price difference, like 3 times higher for the Z1R. But I thought it was necessary to kind of bring up just so that I could describe the sound of the Z7 as best as I could. Now, where this is really good is with very forward vocal music, where you kind of want the vocalist to cool down a little bit. And I'm thinking more like modern top 100 music, where, you know, I'm thinking like Sam Smith, Adele, even rap. That reduction in the vocalist can actually often sound pretty nice because it kind of cools down kind of the super forward nature of those songs, and more involves the background music. Where the V-shape kind of comes in and throws a curveball at that method is when the background music has really boosted highs in some areas, where, you know, that vocalist is going to be stepped back, the vocalist performance is going to be good, the background presentation is going to be a little bit more forward, but sometimes for certain music, especially certain types of rap, it's going to be a little bit too forward. And so you kind of have to play this balancing act with certain songs. This works wonders, and other songs are just, you know, it's kind of just okay. And that leads us to the bass, which is great. It's actually, like the Z1R, plentiful, but not overkill. It's not this crazy bass monster. And the bass response that is here is fairly high quality. There is a little bit of bloat, a little bit of boxiness, but I really haven't met a closed back headphone that was completely devoid of any boxiness. Even the XO Ebonies, real quick, I want to talk about those because lots of people comment about them. Those aren't available anymore. So my recommendation for those is try and pick them up if they're used, but they're not really relevant in the conversation anymore, unfortunately. I've made a couple videos where people are asking like, oh, what about the, you know, how do the Ebonies compare to this? And at this point, unless you can find them on the used market, it doesn't really matter. I think compared to the Z7, I'd personally rather have the Ebony sound with the Z7 build if that was possible. But the Ebonies still win for me, but they're not available. So unfortunately, they're not part of the discussion anymore. But the bass response on this, while not as full as the Ebony, for example, if you are coming from that headphone, and maybe not even as clean, especially in the low end. It is pretty good. I would consider this to be like an 8 or a 9 out of 10 based off of what I would expect for this price point. The bass response is one of the strongest and best selling features for this headphone, and it's pretty good. And then that leads us to imaging and Soundstage, which is also fairly good. I wouldn't call it the best, but it's not disappointing. But again, it's more of a kind of a flatline delivery where things are far left and far right. And again, to compare against the Z1R, that's a little bit more forward in front of you. This is more internal and far right, far left. Although there's definitely more of a boundary on this headphone, and I think that's due to the close back nature of it. And then the imaging for this is fairly strong, and both Soundstage and imaging for the price, I'm fairly happy with, considering that it's a close back headphone. Okay, so let's go ahead and wrap this up. The big question, is this a budget Z1R? I'd say yes. On a base level, it's not providing what the Z1R does, but it's giving you a taste, right? It's giving you, it's definitely giving you a third, and that's what it costs. It's giving you a third of what the Z1R has. This would make a great addition to the video I made about budget versions of expensive headphones. I think this is similar in a lot of ways. Is the Z1R an upgrade? Yeah, definitely. Not necessarily for build comfort. I actually prefer the build of the Z7. I don't know, it just feels a little bit better. It's not as heavy. The clamp force is a little bit stronger, and the actual cup size is ever so slightly smaller. It's just less, it's less big. So the conclusion that this leads me to is, if you have heard the Z1R, can't afford the Z1R, and want something close to that sound signature, of the headphones I've heard, this is the closest to that sound signature, and that's no surprise. They use very, very similar equipment. When it comes to the rest of the headphone industry, I don't really think that this competes as a top of the line headphone at this price point. At $600, I think it's a little bit steep. There's some other headphones I'd rather have at lower costs, although the build is a really strong selling point for this. The headphones that I would rather have are that XOO Ebony. I'd also rather have the Argons, personally, in terms of total sound quality, although again, the build for this is the best in class for sure. I think I might also rather have those Pandas. I think those filled out the mid-range in a way that I really, really enjoyed, although not quite as bassy or as V-shaped as this, and not as wide as the M7s. I'm also very curious, although I haven't heard it yet, so I can't really speak on whether or not it'd be better, but I'm very curious about that new Odyssey LCD1 closed version. I could see the potential for that headphone being closed being better than this. It probably wouldn't Soundstage as wide unless they really significantly change the tuning, but I can imagine the bass being really good, and the treble response on the one is really great. So as long as they can maintain at least 90% of that, I think that is going to be definitely a top performer, and that's going to be, I think, around $400. Don't quote me on that. I'm just guessing. And then another question that I want to answer here, is this better than the MDR 1A? 100%. Way better. Way better. Similar sound signature, but the quality is just far superior. The build is exceptional. I would definitely recommend, if you're looking between these two, 100% the Z7, if you can afford it, and that's the sound signature that you want. So to wrap this up, is it a good headphone? Yes. Is it worth as much as they're asking? No. Not really. The one benefit is that you can purchase this used and be fairly confident that the build is going to last a long time. But this isn't really a headphone that I'm seriously strongly recommended. It's just, if you like it, definitely, but not a top recommendation for me. All right, guys, I think that's going to wrap it up. Thank you very much for watching. Until the next video, my name is Josh, signing off.